Good morning. I think it's morning. Um, how's everyone out there? I don't know. I'm trying to do something interesting at the beginning as an intro. So I don't think it's working. So let me get right to the subject. Um, I would like to bust a myth. I would like to bust a myth, and I used to believe this too. I Sometimes someone mentions it on a TV show or a movie or somewhere. You may read this, and it's talking. It's the idea, the notion that the Nazis, okay, the Third Reich, the third, the belief that a lot of people still have today, believe it or not, that the Third Reich, the Nazi regime, was the most efficient system or regime or organization, whatever you want to call it, the most efficient system, let's say, that ever existed. And even people like myself who knew and understood and acknowledged that the Nazis were evil still believe that. Still believe, well, yeah, the Nazis were evil, absolutely. But boy, were they efficient, you know? And a lot of people believed that and still believe it today. It's an incredible myth that has been propagated from generation to generation since World War II. I'm thinking maybe it's being intentional. Well, it would intentionally be propagated by, say, white supremacists and neo Nazis. Of course, they're going to say that. But it's amazing how many people believe it. Like I said, I used to believe it when I was young and didn't know much about anything. But there's tons and tons of people, obviously, who acknowledge that the Nazis were evil. But still, it's like, yeah, they were evil, but boy, were they efficient. I was like, that was the most efficient system that ever existed. Okay? Not true. I'm here to tell you that is not true. I'm not saying the Nazis were inefficient, but they were no more efficient than any other organization system that ever existed. The Third Reich was not any more efficient than any other, half decent system you know, of doing things, of governing, of producing things. No, they were no more efficient. In fact, in some ways, they were less efficient. Okay? Now, I'll tell you why. Because I don't like to just talk out my ass like a lot of people do. I like to provide proof and evidence and then let you be the judge, right? You decide. I'm not telling anybody what to believe, but here's the evidence. First of all, Hitler was a master manipulator. He convinced tens of millions of Germans to basically work for him, to slave for him in his armaments factories around the clock. I don't know how it worked, but I'm sure they're working to build up his military in only 6 years from the time he became Chancellor of Germany in 1933 to the time the Nazis started their little road trip across Europe in 1939. It was only 6 years. And they built up a huge military in that time. So they must have been working around the clock in those factories, putting in maybe I'm guessing 3 8-hour shifts or maybe 2 12-hour shifts. But the point is, people were working like dogs, like slaves, to produce all this military hardware. Okay? Because Hitler convinced them to do so. Okay? Because, like I said, he was a master manipulator. So, that essentially amounts to slave labor, more or less, right? Not efficiency. That's not efficiency. I mean, I'm sure their factories were just as efficient as any other factories in the world. You know, America was producing airplanes and tanks, and when, you know, I'm sure there were factories in lots of countries just like there are today. And the factory, by definition, is something that tends to be kind of an efficient thing. And so I'm not saying they were inefficient, but what enabled them to produce all this hardware in a short amount of time was not efficiency, it was slavery. Basically, it was tens of millions of Germans working their butts off for the big boss, right? The big boss. That's one thing. The second thing related to it, also slave labor, was the fact that when the Germans, the Nazis, started invading and occupying other countries in Europe, they basically abducted people and forced them into, into doing slave labor for them, forced labor. They grabbed like about 500,000 citizens of Paris when they invaded France. They just grabbed 500,000 citizens of Paris, forced them into labor, forced labor. God knows what they did in Poland and Hungary and those places. I mean, we know, history tells us of the horrible things they did. But as far as the numbers go, how many people they compelled into forced labor, I'm sure you could look that up. I haven't looked it up, but it's an easy bet that it's in the millions. It's an easy bet that it's in the. I mean, if they grab 500,000 people just out of Paris alone, imagine they occupied most of Europe, so people were like a resource to them, right? They didn't care about any of those people, and they would work them to death. They would work them to death, and then just grab more, right? So people were almost an endless resource to the Nazis. That's how they were able to build their defensive lines, their more war machinery, and those incredible structures like the impenetrable U-boat pens on the coast of France. How are they? We're talking millions of tons of concrete and steel. The Allies tried everything to bomb those pens, but they were so incredibly built that even their biggest bombs couldn't penetrate it. How are they able to build those things in such a short amount of time? Slave labor. Okay? Slavery is not the same as efficiency. Okay? Slave labor is not the same as efficiency. It's not efficiency that built those things. It was slavery. Millions and millions of expendable, as the Nazis viewed them, expendable slaves. Okay? I mean, you give me a couple of million slaves, I can build something incredible. I'll build a fucking city on the moon with 2 or 3 million slaves. I can build a fucking city on the moon, right? That's not efficiency. That's manpower, okay, or people power. Um, yeah, that's what that was. And okay, that's point number one. Majority of what they built and achieved was through slave labor, right? Not efficiency, not particularly I mean, I'm not saying they were inefficient. Of course, they were efficient, but like I said, they weren't any more efficient than any other system that ever existed. They just happen to have millions of people at their disposal that they didn't give a shit about, and they just fucking kidnapped them and forced them to build whatever they wanted. The second thing is, you don't have a very efficient organization when people are killing each other to try and like get closer to the inner circle. Okay? There were times when Nazis actually, killed each other, to try and rise up in the ranks. One example of that is for a while there, in the earlier days of the regime, you had two, or this may have happened even before Hitler became chancellor. Anyway, at some point, it doesn't matter, but at some point you had two basic security organizations. You had the SS, which we've all heard of, and the SA. And they were kind of competing against each other. So what happened was the head of the SS, I believe at the time it was Heinrich Himmler, if I'm not mistaken. I know he was the head later on, but back when this happened, I think he was also, the head of the SS. Basically, he murdered the head of the SA and some of the top guys in the SA, thus eliminating the SA and making the SS the number one, security force that Hitler relied on. So that's what happened, is that he just bumped the other guy off. When people are killing each other in your organization, it's not good. It doesn't create a lot of efficiency. Can you imagine Microsoft? If people were knocking each other off, just to get closer to Bill Gates, just to get closer to the inner circle type of thing, just to get higher power, more power and prestige. It wouldn't be very efficient. It wouldn't be very efficient, People at Walmart, assassinating each other, to get closer to the upper levels. It doesn't lend toward efficiency at all. So that's another thing that made them. And there was some redundancy, in the Nazi party. Everybody wanted prestige. Everyone wanted to wear the nice uniform, They're nice uniforms manufactured by Hugo Boss. True story. Oops, sorry. I shouldn't mention names like that here. But that was, I'm not condemning Hugo Boss. That was in the past, right? Let's just say Hugo Boss is an awesome, in here, now in 2024, Hugo Boss is an awesome clothing company. I own several Hugo Boss products, and I highly recommend them. Okay. But anyway, that's irrelevant. But let's just focus on the subject. So they wanted to wear the nice, sexy uniforms, you know. And they would get, just like today in government, they would hire friends and their nephews and nieces and they give them a nice office. And a lot of these jobs were like, you know, just make work kind of thing. There was redundancy. There was redundancy, which also is inefficient. And the other thing is, one of the big things is, if you look at the organizational chart of a modern organization, business, government, whatever, you got, you know, the president on top, the vice presidents, you know, the supervisors, the different departments, the different department heads, the supervisors, the foremen, and the workers, right? And the neat thing about that is information can flow up and down and sideways. People can share information, and that tends to be more the most efficient system. However, that was not the Nazi system. That was not the way the Third Reich worked, and in fact, no dictatorship works that way. In a dictatorship, you do not have the chain of command, organizational hierarchy there. In a dictatorship, it's more like a wheel. Okay? Who's at the center? Well, of course, the dictator. In the case of the Third Reich, Hitler was at the center of the wheel. All of his top men were around him, and you could say it was like the spokes of a wheel, right? Line going from Hitler, this guy, head of the Air Force, head of the Army, head of the SS, head of production, head of this, head of, propaganda, who's in charge of the economy, who's in charge of agriculture, blah, 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 right? It was these spokes radiating out from the center, from the dictator, the main man, and they were all answerable to him, and they themselves were not connected, okay? It's not like an actual wheel, because then they'd have to draw a line, but there's no line. These guys were all isolated from each other. And the only person they were answerable to was Hitler, okay? Which is not efficient. It's not, because these guys are not allowed to share information. No information can flow from one department to another. People only know, what they're required to know, or need to know. They're all on a need to know basis, and they're all answerable to the dictator, which is exactly what the dictator wants. He wants to be in control. He or she wants to be in control of all the information. He doesn't want anyone else to have any more information than they absolutely require to do their jobs. But he is connected to everyone, and he is in control and has access to all the information. And that's exactly what a dictator wants, right? But that is not efficient. It's not an efficient way to run an organization at all. There are other things I could mention. Tactical stuff, battlefield stuff, like designing really big, monstrous, impressive tanks like the Tiger tank and the King Tiger tank, which looked really amazing and intimidating, but broke down all the time because they were over-engineered or got stuck in the mud during the spring thaw or the autumn rains, especially on the Eastern Front, because they were too damn heavy. For Hitler, it was all about being big and impressive. He wanted to build these super weapons that turned out to be very inefficient. I mean, what good is a tank if it's broken or if it's stuck in the mud, right? That's inefficient, right? American Sherman tank and the Russian T-34 tanks were not nearly as impressive and scary, but they worked, and they worked well. And they could build shitloads of them. They were not that expensive. When something is super expensive, you can't build too many of them, right? You can't build a lot of them. You just don't have the economic resources. So the King Tigers, the ones that actually worked, often got swarmed, by the numerical superiority of the T-34s on the Eastern Front and the Shermans on the Western Front, and that's not efficient. Wasn't very smart at all. Hitler always held a lot of his forces in reserve when he could have used them. Like on D-Day, he didn't send out his Air Force. Historians kind of have a joke about it. They say D-Day was the greatest air battle in history that never happened. Any reasonable commander would have sent out his Air Force, but Hitler decided to keep them in reserve. I guess he was waiting for his own Armageddon. I guess he was holding his forces in reserve for the big glorious day when he thought he was gonna, win the war, and vindicate himself, kind of thing. That's what narcissists do. They want to prove that they were right. I was right all along, and you all were wrong, right? So he was probably waiting for his big day to prove that he was right. What are you gonna do? He lost the war, and that's not very efficient, is it? I mean, when you go to war, you kind of plan to win, So there you go. I mean, that, it's a myth. Nazi efficiency. The notion that the Nazis were the most efficient system ever, it's a myth, it's a lie, it's a fairy tale. What else can I say? Any white supremacists out there, if I burst your bubble and you need some emotional support, you can suck my Greek balls.